My name is Pravet. I'm 81 years old, and I want to begin by saying something that took me decades to understand clearly enough to live by. Toxic people are not the real problem. How you respond to toxic people is the real problem, or more precisely, the real opportunity. Because every difficult person who has ever entered my life, every person who was unkind, manipulative, consistently draining, dishonest, or simply impossible to be around without losing something essential of myself, every one of them taught me something about where I was still unfinished, about where I still had habits that needed to be examined, about where I was still giving my inner ground away too quickly. I did not always see it that way. For many years I simply suffered around difficult people and told myself the suffering was their fault. And in some immediate sense it was. But the suffering that stayed, the suffering that lived in me long after the interaction was over, that was mine to understand. Maybe there is someone in your life right now who costs you more than any other person. Someone who leaves you feeling depleted, irritated, or vaguely wrong about yourself every time you spend time near them. Someone whose presence changes the quality of your thinking and your mood in ways you cannot always explain. Maybe it is someone you cannot simply remove from your life, a family member, a colleague, someone whose presence is not optional. If that is true for you, stay with me, because what I am about to share is not about how to fix difficult people, or how to expose them, or how to feel superior to them. It is about how to remain genuinely yourself in their presence. I was born in northern Thailand, in a community where the teaching around difficult people was essentially this: avoid them if you can, and endure them if you cannot. There was wisdom in that, but it was incomplete, because avoiding and enduring both leave the inner work undone. Avoiding difficult people sometimes keeps you from the very friction that would have revealed something important about where you needed to grow. Enduring them without understanding what is actually happening inside you just teaches the nervous system to associate certain kinds of relationships with helpless suffering. Neither of those outcomes is peace. They are simply different forms of the same unexamined pain. And here's what I didn't understand then. The disturbance that a difficult person creates in me is never entirely about them. It is partly about the specific places in me that their behavior reaches, the particular fears they activate, the specific beliefs about my own worth that their dismissiveness or cruelty or manipulation touches. Two people can spend an hour with the same difficult person and leave having been affected in completely different ways. That difference is not about the difficult person. It is about the inner landscape each person brought to the encounter, and understanding that inner landscape is the beginning of real protection. The first key I want to share is this: distinguish between what belongs to them and what belongs to you. Difficult people are almost always operating from their own unexamined pain. Their manipulation comes from fear. Their cruelty comes from wounds they have never been willing to look at. Their dishonesty comes from a self that does not trust what honest exposure would reveal. None of that means you should accept harmful behavior, But when you can see that someone is acting from their pain rather than their truth, you stop taking their behavior as a verdict on your worth. That single shift changes everything about how much power they have over your inner state. The second key is to know your own triggers before entering the encounter. A trigger is not weakness, it is information. It tells you where your inner ground is still soft, where an old wound is still close to the surface, where a particular kind of behavior has the power to reach something deep because that deep thing has not yet been fully understood or healed. When you know your triggers in advance, you can meet them with preparation rather than surprise. You can notice the familiar tightening without immediately following the familiar reaction. The third key is to stop requiring the difficult person to change before you find peace. This is perhaps the most important and the most difficult, because the mind's natural response to a difficult person is to focus all its energy on the wrongness of that person's behavior, on how they should be different, on how unfair it is that they are not different. And all of that focus keeps your peace entirely dependent on a change that is not yours to control. Peace that depends on another person changing is not peace, it is just waiting. And waiting for difficult people to change is one of the most effective ways to ensure that your own inner development stops. The fourth key is the practice of equanimity in their presence. Not false calm, not performed composure, genuine equanimity. The capacity to remain present to what is happening without being entirely swept into it. This is built through practice, not through willpower. It comes from meditation, from working with your own reactivity in quieter moments, from understanding your inner landscape well enough that you can recognize when you are beginning to be pulled and choose not to follow all the way. The fifth key is to speak from clarity rather than from reaction. When something needs to be said to a difficult person, the quality of what you say matters enormously. Speaking from reaction gives them something to use against you. It confirms the story they may already have about who you are. Speaking from clarity, from a place that is grounded and honest and not inflamed, does something very different. It creates a different kind of exchange. Not always a pleasant one, but one where you have remained true to yourself. The sixth key is to set boundaries from values rather than from anger. A boundary set in anger is a wall. It protects, but it also closes. A boundary set from values is an honest expression of what you will and will not participate in. It does not require the other person to understand it or agree with it. It simply requires you to hold it with consistency. And holding it consistently, not emotionally but clearly, gradually teaches both of you something about what is actually possible in the relationship. The seventh key is to protect your energy deliberately. Not every interaction requires all of you. Not every difficult person has earned full access to your inner life. Learning to be present without being permeable, to engage without surrendering, to listen without absorbing everything as your responsibility is a practical skill. It is built through knowing when to step back, when to let a statement pass without response, when to refuse to participate in a dynamic that only exists when you cooperate with it. The eighth key is to find the teaching in the difficulty. Every person who disturbs your peace is pointing at something unresolved in your relationship with peace itself. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a useful one. When someone's dismissiveness destroys your composure, that destruction reveals that your composure was partly dependent on being treated with respect. When someone's chaos makes you anxious, that anxiety reveals how much your peace depends on external order. These are not criticisms, they are invitations to go deeper into your own inner work. The ninth key is compassion as a protective practice. This may sound counterintuitive, but genuine compassion, the kind that sees another person suffering clearly without excusing their behavior, does something important to your own inner state. It removes the bitterness. And bitterness is one of the most damaging things a difficult person can leave inside you, because it continues to damage you long after the encounter has ended. Compassion does not mean approval. It means releasing the poison they placed in you by understanding where it came from. The 10th key is to limit exposure without guilt. Sometimes the wisest response to a genuinely toxic person is distance, not anger, not drama, simply the quiet decision to reduce the amount of time and energy you invest in a relationship that consistently costs more than it gives. This is not a failure of compassion. It is an act of self-respect, and self-respect is one of the foundations of genuine spiritual maturity. The 11th key is to refuse to carry what belongs to them after the encounter ends. Many people spend far more time with difficult people in their minds than they ever do in physical proximity. They replay, they rehearse, they compose the responses they never gave. They give difficult people residence inside their inner life, long after the actual interaction has concluded. Learning to put down what belongs to another person when you leave their presence is one of the most liberating practices available. It does not require resolution, it requires recognition. That story is theirs, that pain is theirs. I do not need to carry it with me into the rest of my day. The 12th key is to return to your own center after every difficult encounter, not as a dramatic ritual, as a simple, deliberate act of returning to what you know to be true about yourself. A few breaths, a moment of stillness, a brief return to the quality of presence that the encounter may have disturbed. This return is not about pretending the difficulty did not happen. It is about refusing to let the difficulty become your new baseline. It is the choice to come back to yourself rather than to remain in the shape that the difficult person temporarily pressed you into. What most people don't realize is that none of these keys require the difficult person to cooperate. They are entirely practices of your own inner life, which means they are entirely within your reach, regardless of what the other person does. The difficult person does not need to become less difficult. You need to become less available to be diminished by them. And that becoming is the real work. It is slow, it is unglamorous. It requires honesty about your own patterns and your own triggers and your own unfinished places. but it is the only work that actually produces the peace you are looking for. At 81 years old, I can tell you that the people who disturbed my peace most consistently were also the people who taught me the most. Not because their behavior was acceptable, but because the disturbance they created in me was always pointing somewhere real, and following that pointing, honestly and without self-pity, took me somewhere I could not have arrived through comfort alone. Tell me in the comments about the person or type of person who consistently challenges your peace most. Not to complain, just to name it honestly, because naming it clearly is the first step toward understanding what it is actually teaching you. And if this message gave you something real, stay close to this space, because this kind of understanding, returned to again and again, changes not just how you handle difficult people, but who you are when you meet them.